The United Nations as we know it is effectively over, and the United States has just officially launched its replacement. On Thursday morning, in Davos, Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum, President Donald Trump unveiled what he calls the Board of Peace. On the surface, this is being presented as a humanitarian initiative designed to manage the ceasefire in Gaza and oversee reconstruction in the Middle East. But if you look at the fine print of the charter, and if you look at the price tag attached to membership, it becomes immediately clear that this is not just a committee, it is a direct competitor to the established international order. For the last 80 years, American foreign policy has been anchored by the UN Security Council and the NATO alliance. That era ended this week. We are witnessing a fundamental pivot in how the United States projects power. We are moving from a system based on consensus and alliances to a system based on transaction and capital. The headline isn't just that a new board exists. The headline is that the United States is building a VIP club for global management, and the entry fee is $1 billion. While the mainstream media is focusing on the photo ops in Davos, they are missing the critical realignment happening behind the scenes. Why are America's oldest allies, like France and Canada, publicly refusing to join, while adversaries and autocracies are lining up to sign the check? And what does it mean for the American taxpayer when the global security architecture is privatized? Today, we're going to break down the charter, the signatories, and the strategy to understand why the world map just changed forever. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we have to look at the mechanics of the launch itself. President Trump took the stage at Davos, not just as a head of state, but as the chairman of this new body. The structure of the Board of Peace is explicitly designed to bypass the gridlock of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council has 5 permanent members and 10 rotating members, often paralyzed by vetoes from Russia or China. The Board of Peace operates differently. It is pay to play. According to the draft charter circulated at the summit, securing a permanent seat on this board requires a direct payment of at least $1 billion. This is a staggering departure from diplomatic norms. In the UN, influence is theoretically based on geopolitical weight and treaty obligations. On the Board of Peace, influence is purchased. This creates a barrier to entry that instantly filters out smaller developing nations and prioritizes wealthy states or those willing to liquidate assets to gain favor with Washington. President Trump has stated that he expects to chair this board for life. This centralization of power removes the rotating leadership model we are used to in international organizations. It places the United States, specifically the executive branch, at the permanent head of the table. The implications for the U.S. dollar and U.S. leverage are massive. By tethering global conflict resolution to a financial buy-in, the administration is essentially monetizing American security guarantees. Let's look at who bought in. The list of signatories is a roadmap of the new American alliance structure. As of Thursday morning, roughly 35 to 59 countries have signaled their intent to join. The core of this group is not the G7. It is a bloc of Middle Eastern and Eurasian powers. We have confirmed acceptance from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. These are nations that have grown increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of UN diplomacy and are comfortable with transactional power dynamics. They are joined by a specific subset of European and South American leaders. Argentina, under President Milei, has accepted. Hungary, led by Viktor Orban, has accepted. These are leaders who share a specific ideological alignment with the current administration. They view international bureaucracies as impediments to national sovereignty. By joining the Board of Peace, they are effectively bypassing Brussels and the UN General Assembly to deal directly with the White House. However, the story gets darker when we look at who is missing. This is where the fracture in the West becomes undeniable. France has officially declined the invitation. The French Foreign Ministry didn't just say no, they issued a statement saying the board's charter does not correspond with UN resolutions and is contrary to the UN Charter itself. This is a diplomatic way of saying that the Board of Peace is illegal under current international law. Canada has also balked. The Canadian finance minister stated stated explicitly that Ottawa would not pay the $1 billion fee. Slovenia's Prime Minister, Robert Golob, went further, warning that the board dangerously interferes with the broader international order. Britain is holding out, saying they are not joining at present. This is the specific consequence of the launch. The Western alliance is splitting in real time. For decades, the U.S. and Europe moved in lockstep through NATO and the UN. Now the U.S. is creating a parallel structure that excludes the Europeans, who cannot or will not pay the fee. We are seeing the creation of a two-tiered world. Tier 1 is the Board of Peace, led by the U.S. and backed by wealthy Gulf states and sympathetic strongmen. Tier 2 is the traditional UN system, led by a confused and fracturing Europe. But here's the twist. This is the detail that changes the entire calculation and suggests that this board is not just about peace treaties, but about financial warfare and asset seizure. While Western allies are walking away, Russia is leaning in. President Vladimir Putin stated on Wednesday that Moscow is considering the invitation, but he proposed a caveat that exposes the true genius, or perhaps the true danger, of this scheme. Putin proposed paying the $1 billion entry fee using Russian assets that are currently frozen in the United States. Think about the implications of that. The U.S. holds billions in frozen Russian central bank reserves. By accepting this form of payment, the Board of Peace effectively launders that frozen capital back into the global system, but under U.S. control. It turns a diplomatic standoff into a funding mechanism for this new organization. If Russia joins the Board of Peace using money the U.S. already controls, it creates a bizarre feedback loop where the U.S. is funding its own rivals' participation in exchange for legitimizing the new board. This maneuver, if it happens, would completely undermine the sanctions regime that the European Union has been trying to maintain. It would explain why France is so terrified. If the U.S. cuts a side deal with Russia through this board, Europe is left holding the bag on sanctions, while Washington and Moscow do business at the new table in Davos. The pretext for all of this, of course, is Gaza. The administration is framing the Board of Peace as the necessary evolution of the ceasefire agreement from October. The narrative is that the UN failed to stop the violence, so a new, stronger hand is needed. And there is truth to the failure. The violence in Gaza has continued despite the truce. Aid is struggling to get in. The UN has been unable to enforce its resolutions. However, the scope of the board has already expanded far beyond Gaza. President Trump explicitly said in his remarks that while it was designed for Israel-Hamas ceasefire, he now sees it taking a wider role in addressing global challenges. He mentioned that Gaza continues, not at the same level as before, but the focus was clearly on the future utility of the board. He described Gaza as a beautiful piece of property, emphasizing the real estate and development potential. This confirms the transactional nature of the vision. The board is likely to function as a combination of a security council and a sovereign wealth fund. It will seemingly identify conflict zones, suppress the violence through the combined military or economic pressure of its members, and then open the zone for investment and reconstruction, presumably led by companies from the member nations. This brings us to the question of legitimacy. A board composed of the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Russia is a formidable power bloc. It controls the vast majority of the world's military hardware and energy reserves. If this group decides to enforce a policy, who's going to stop them? The UN General Assembly can pass resolutions, but they lack enforcement power. The Board of Peace represents the privatization of enforcement. But there's a danger here for the United States. By creating a rival to the UN, we are actively dismantling the system that we built in 1945. The UN was designed to give every nation a voice, however small, to prevent the world from sliding back into great power blocks. The Board of Peace is the return of great power blocks. It is a return to a 19th century style of diplomacy, where the rich and the powerful decide the fate of the small and the poor, behind closed doors. For the American citizen, this shift has direct consequences. It moves U.S. foreign policy away from values-based alliances. We are no longer asking if a country is a democracy or if it respects human rights before we partner with them. We are asking if they have $1 billion and if they are willing to sign the charter. This opens the door for deep entanglement with regimes that do not share American interests beyond the immediate transaction. Furthermore, the isolation of Europe is a strategic risk. If the Board of Peace succeeds, the European Union becomes geopolitical irrelevancy. But if the Board of Peace fails or turns into a club for autocracies to validate each other, the U.S. will have alienated its oldest and most reliable friends for a venture that might collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. There is also the domestic question. Who authorizes U.S. participation in this board? Who oversees the funds? If countries are paying billions into a board chaired by the American president, is that money subject to congressional oversight, or does it exist in a supranational gray zone? These are questions that Congress has yet to answer and likely hasn't even asked. The launch of the Board of Peace is not just a news item about a summit in Switzerland. It is a declaration that the post-Cold War era is finished. The United States has decided that the United Nations is obsolete, and it has decided to build a new architecture based on wealth and executive power.
We are watching the separation of the world into two camps, those who can pay for peace and those who cannot. The U.S. has placed its bet on the former. Whether this brings stability or accelerates global chaos is the question we will be answering for the next decade. But one thing is certain, the United Nations is no longer the only game in town, and for all intents and purposes, the era of global consensus is over.